This is Teddy Roosevelt, just back from charging up San Juan Hill. Damn it, Professor Buzzkill was already at the top, collecting historical evidence, busting myths, and taking names. I have to admit that he's a worthy competitor, and a damn fine rough rider. Join me in listening to this episode. It's sure to be bully.
Yes, it's us again, Professor Buzzkill and crew in the Buzzkill bunker. And of course, the crew, the best crew, is here. And that's Professor Phil Nash from Penn State to join us to talk about World War II in the Pacific. And we're going to call this part 2 of World War II in the Pacific. Professor, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
We left the Buzzkillers hanging last time when we talked about the war in the Pacific because we talked about the Coral Sea, or you talked about the Coral Sea, and then Midway, and there was a third thing that was going to happen, but of course you deliberately teased it and tried to draw it out to get more listeners.
We wanted people to come back for more.
That's right. And boy, coming back for more in the Pacific Wars.
Oh my God.
There's a lot of more to come back to.
Absolutely.
So what's the third? Because you did talk about 3 things that turned the Pacific
and once
War
again,
around.
in a relatively brief period.
Yeah,
We're talking about a period of just a few months between May and August, or the beginning in August 1942. It's Coral Sea, Midway, and the third is Guadalcanal, which is pretty famous.
Yeah,
it's not the biggest island. It's one of the islands in the Solomons. Solomons are at least a half dozen major islands in a sort of a long string.
Yeah,
and once again, this is to the northeast of New Guinea. These are very, very sparsely populated islands, dense jungle. Lots of ravines and mountain ridges, very rough terrain on most of them. Guadalcanal, so all the Solomons had been occupied by the Japanese, but only lightly defended by the Japanese.
Okay.
It hadn't deployed major forces there. And so the United States took advantage of that fact, and they landed the 1st U.S. Marine Division on Guadalcanal in early August. The landing was actually unopposed.
Oh, no kidding.
And so they quickly moved in and took the airfield that the Japanese had just built. But then the Japanese realized that they can't let the Americans keep this island, and so they sent reinforcements. And what followed in September, October, and November, December 1942, months of brutal fighting under absolutely atrocious conditions. And jungle, I really can't convey to the listeners how awful jungle fighting is. By the way, fighting generally is awful.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Fighting in extremely cold conditions or in mountains or in the desert is also miserable. But it's really the worst of all in tropical rainforest, where you have to contend not only with the enemy, but you have to contend with the rain, the heat, the humidity, the insects, the wild animals, all of the diseases like malaria and beriberi and dengue, and some of these things that will not only lay you low, but will kill you. Yeah. The bizarre and also dangerous skin diseases and fungus and infections, and just the nastiness never stops, really. Yeah. And yet you're expected to remain disciplined and fight against a tenacious enemy.
And conquer territory.
And conquer territory, and it's awful. And in a way, in Guadalcanal anyway, the Japanese have it worse because they underestimate the size of the American force. Yeah. The Japanese force is never large enough for what it's trying to accomplish, which is to crush the Americans and push them in the sea. And they're not properly provisioned. Their supply line becomes under increasing threat, and toward the end of the campaign, the Japanese troops are starving to death.
So, in addition to all the conditions you just mentioned, there's a malnutrition.
Well, and it's those factors converge, right? How are you going to fight off disease when you're malnourished?
Yeah.
And fighting, and so it is. It is absolutely brutal fighting. The Japanese attacks are notoriously fierce and brave, but they are also weak and uncoordinated. I mean, some of these really are just sort of mindless frontal assaults where the Japanese forces just melt away in front of American machine guns. That does happen here. Yeah. I believe it's for all of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese lose about 50% of their force killed in action.
50%?
50. That's extraordinary. In most military history, any force that's getting hammered that badly withdraws long before they get to that point. You might suffer 50% total casualties, like killed, wounded, and missing, which is also horrible. But 50% dead is just extraordinary. It just shows you how badly they are annihilated. Yeah, so they can't resupply their force, and by long story short, by February 1943, they're forced to evacuate the island, and the Americans secure it, and then the Americans after that proceed to secure a lot of the rest of the Solomons.
Okay.
And this is important because after a string of defeats in the first half of 1942, this is really the case where the U.S. proves that its soldiers and Marines can go toe to toe with the Imperial Japanese Army.
Okay.
Which up until this point has been an open question. Right? Yeah. You put up a staunch defense against long odds in the Philippines, but can you actually? It's an analogous to the Germans, right? The Germans go on this run. And it's like, can you actually beat the Germans? We don't know if we can. And then when you discover, it's like the Russians of Stalingrad. When you discover that you can, beat this really tenacious and well trained foe, that's huge for you. It's huge for your morale.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. So each of these battles, they're the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, they're sort of turning points at roughly the same time, and not always in exactly the same way. But it's all happening at the same time, and it's clear now that the Allies are turning this around. And after this, the Japanese defensive perimeter is only going to shrink. They're not going to make any further advances.
Okay, so one of the things you talked about a lot in the first part of this show last time was how the Japanese had tried this big push southeast.
Right.
And so the perimeter is, and then, of course, Midway and causes a problem in their backyard, so to speak.
Right.
Does that mean everything then is moving, sort of contracting up north?
After this, absolutely.
Okay.
At different paces, this vast Japanese defensive perimeter that stretches from Burma in the west to China in the northwest to the Aleutians in the northeast. I'm trying to keep my compass straight in my head.
Right,
to the Solomons in the southeast. That massive perimeter is now going to start to shrink as they get pushed back, and it's going to take place. We'll talk about it, but it's basically going to be via island hopping toward the central Pacific as you push the Japanese back because you leap from one island to the next.
But I don't want to leave this. You talked briefly about how awful this sort of fighting was and the conditions, how bad they were. Let's get more into that. What was ground combat really like? Because I think of ground combat as big infantry across continental spaces, and it's not like that here.
Vast armies, right? And the character of combat at sort of the micro level is different in different theaters and different wars. And it's worth remembering. And once again, I highly recommend the HBO series, The Pacific, because it captures this pretty well. Because just technically and in terms of realism and in terms of sort of a warts and all history, it does a much better job than Hollywood usually does in capturing the reality of combat. But I'm here to say that the war in the Pacific has a viciousness to it, and so it has an edge to it. That the only other analog I would draw attention to in World War II would be the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians.
Oh, okay.
When you it's sort of no quarter
and meat grinding,
right? And meat grinding and just a sort of low regard for the enemy, and then acting accordingly. For example, if you look at the way American soldiers behave in the Pacific and the way they behave against the Germans in a place like France or Italy, they're very, very different. And I'll explain what I'm talking about here. First of all, you should know that the Japanese soldiers operated under the famous or infamous Bushido Code, the Code of Bushido, which literally means way of the warrior.
Yeah.
And this is part of Japanese training. It's part of Japanese military culture going way, way back. And under this, for example, under the Bushido Code, surrender is a fate worse than death.
Okay.
So right there you have a difference. This means your average Japanese soldier is under extreme pressure never to surrender, to fight to the death.
Right.
To fight to the last bullet. When you run out of ammunition, fix your bayonet or pull your samurai sword if you're an officer, and try to take one last enemy with you.
Yeah, and again, the extremes of this are the holdouts we find later on in the 40s.
Absolutely.
And even the emperor.
And in a couple of cases in the 60s and 70s where they find a Japanese soldier who's middle-aged, wearing rags, and has not yet surrendered because he hasn't received any orders to contrary to what he received in 1945.
Yeah, and the emperor, people thought the emperor was going to kill himself at the end of the war, that is, because of this whole same thing.
Right, exactly. Right. Look at how many Japanese officers in particular commit ritual suicide rather than fall into enemy hands, or because they've been disgraced. At Midway, there's Japanese admirals who decide to go down with their ship, which, that's partly the naval code you see in a lot of navies. But throughout the Pacific War, the Americans and other Allied forces are going to take very few Japanese prisoners.
Wow.
And that's almost entirely because they refuse to surrender.
Now, is there an effect that has on Allied prisoners of war?
Yes, because at least the Japanese are consistent because surrender is disgraceful.
Yeah.
When an enemy surrenders to you, they are also disgraced in your eyes. They have now
Gotcha.
revealed themselves to be worse than dogs. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese have no compunction about killing Allied prisoners of war, which they do in large numbers. They don't always do that, but they often do that. And you can go online, you can see pictures, for example, famous picture of a Japanese officer beheading a captured Australian pilot who's blindfolded and has his hands tied behind his back and they're about to cut his head off.
Yeah.
They executed some of the Doolittle flyers. The Japanese killed a lot of POWs. And those that they didn't kill, they mistreated or used as slaves.
Right.
Or worked to death. So that's part of us. And then, by the way, and stories about that get back to the Allied side.
Yeah.
And that's another reason to not try to fall into Japanese hands. It's a reason to kill the few Japanese who you may get your hands on who are alive and unarmed.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are stories from the Pacific fighting where an American platoon leader in a Marine rifle company would say, well, this morning, boys, we're not taking any prisoners.
Yeah.
Which,
Wow.
you know, you can understand it, but it's also a war crime.
Yeah.
There's also the revenge motive, very strong among the Allies, particularly the Americans. Revenge for Pearl Harbor, revenge for Bataan. This is all part of American propaganda.
Which, after all, weren't that long ago. And
No, they're
a year or
fresh
two
in
before.
everybody's
Yeah.
mind. And by the way, I would even argue that the propaganda is sort of pushing on an open door. You don't need to fire people up that much, but they are being
Well, that's
fired
true.
up.
Yeah.
And also just the Japanese war crimes in general puts a lot of American soldiers in a mood for vengeance. This is all layered on top of existing mutual racism.
Ah, yes.
The Japanese in Asia and worldwide consider themselves racially superior.
Yeah, that's another important point. We don't tend to think about them considering themselves superior to other Asians as well as everybody else.
Absolutely.
That's
And
one of the reasons the Chinese atrocities are so bad.
Exactly, correct. And
Atrocities in China are so bad.
yes, and throughout Asia.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Throughout Asia. And then one of the reasons why their occupations are going to be so brutal. But they also consider themselves racially superior to white people. White Americans were almost uniformly racist toward Asians well before World War II, including toward Asian Americans, including Japanese Americans on the West Coast. And then, as I think I mentioned, worth separate mention is that the mutual racism was fueled by propaganda. In Japanese propaganda, Westerners, and a lot of it focuses on FDR and Churchill, Westerners are depicted as animals or demons or gangsters. In Western and American propaganda, the quote-unquote Japs, as they were regularly referred to, are shown as vermin, as savages, as apes. You know, you don't have to look very far to find posters with the stereotypical buck-toothed Japanese evildoer with his glasses, and you know maybe he's got a knife dripping in blood, and he's about to rape a white woman. So basically, this propaganda fuels mutual dehumanization,
right?
Which then also fuels the atrocities.
Yeah, and this is again. I hate to keep coming back to this. We did a show why World War II was so bad and why the numbers were so high, and there are lots of reasons, and this is certainly one of them. One of the most disheartening about human nature.
And also, and I stress mutual. In other words, where it becomes this sort of tit for tat, mutually reinforcing degradation, and or mutually reinforcing slide into greater and greater atrocity. So you had routine execution of enemy prisoners of war or people trying to surrender, Japanese using prisoners of war as slaves, the dismemberment of enemy dead for trophies. And this is, I think, a really telling difference because, for example, your average GI in Europe is not typically going to dismember a German soldier's corpse, boil the head, and then send the skull home. Whereas that did happen in the Pacific. In fact, I think it's one of the most amazingly graphic pictures in Life magazine in World War II. Is a picture of 1944. They show this young woman writing a letter to her boyfriend in the Pacific, and she's looking at the skull that he had sent her. which is, I mean, considering wartime censorship, that's sort of an amazing thing that they would publish that.
Because that's going to raise even the Japanese hostility even higher.
Well,
for the soldiers
but also, typically you don't admit your own atrocious behavior, right?
Yeah.
But in a way, it sort of proves the point, which is they don't see it as atrocious behavior
No,
when
that's right.
when you dismember a dead Japanese body. And there were GIs who collected, or Marines who collected gold teeth, for example, which is also depicted in the Pacific, that HBO series. So a lot of this is not done in Europe between, say, Americans and Germans or Americans and Italians. And that's because, as I'm arguing, the nature of the combat in the Pacific was just so sort of hopped up, so fueled by racism and mutual dehumanization that the nature of combat just becomes much, much more brutal.
Oh, well, it's not the best. It's not the most cheery time to take a break for station identification, but it's something we have to do for to fulfill our show business responsibilities. So we'll leave it there and then try to come back and talk about where things stand in 1943 in a few minutes.
Hello, this is Lady Buzzkill. If you simply must follow my husband's deluded podcast hobby, you can also find him on Facebook, Twitter @BuzzkillProf, and Instagram @ProfessorBuzzkill. You might go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com if you're so inclined, and support him on Patreon. Subscribe to his email list, if you must, and shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. The only thing that seems to keep him from making more noise and frightening the horses is that the Professor Buzzkill Show is part of Entertainment One's podcast network. And of course, it's available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Finally, I suppose I should thank you for listening. So, thank you for listening.
Okay, we're back. Professor Nash, again, we're talking about things in the World War II in the Pacific that seem so awful. It's amazing to me in many ways that the fighting can keep going on, but it's still we've only gotten until 1943. Where do things stand in 1943?
Yeah,
and two more years left.
Right. In a way, in 1943, things are just intensifying compared to 1942.
Yeah.
Because 1943 is a year when American mobilization is really coming into full swing.
Yeah.
Our naval and air and army forces are expanding rapidly. Our war industry has converted to a full war footing, and we're really cranking the material out in amazing ways. But in this year, 1943, you will see fighting all around the Japanese perimeter. There's no, and I'll put it this way: there's no point in their perimeter where they're not under pressure.
Right.
Really, only in China they're not. I mean, they're not under pressure of being pushed back, but they still have to fight there. It's still a major commitment. Still have 1 million men there. It's still a major drain on their resources. But they're fighting in the Aleutians. They're going to be driven out of the Aleutians in some sharp, quick but brutal fights.
And the perimeter, we're not talking about the perimeter just around Japan. We're talking about this perimeter.
Defensive perimeter, which occupies probably a fifth of the globe, I'd have to guess. But they're fighting in Burma, they're fighting in New Guinea, they're fighting in the Solomons. The Allied victory in Guadalcanal was quickly followed by, as I think I mentioned, this thing called island hopping, which once again gets at the nature of combat in the Pacific, which you don't have a front line really. It's point to point. There's maybe a bad analogy, but it's the equivalent of exploring a city either using a map on the street or using the subway. And it's point to point.
Pause to think about that.
What is he talking about? Yeah,
no, that's exactly the way it looks like on a subway map.
Right, and it's point, and you don't necessarily have a sense of the greater geography. And here you couldn't because it's all open sea, with the exception of the islands. But what it means is, in a way, it's difficult for the Japanese because if you heavily fortify an island like Rabaul, which is a little further west from the Solomons, this was their major base in this region.
Right.
Which, by the way, MacArthur wanted to attack head on, to his additional discredit. A place like that, if it's really well defended, you don't attack it. You attack something weaker behind it, take that, and force them to pull out of Rabaul because now they've been cut off. So basically, island hopping, where you invade one island and use it as a base from which to seize the next island, and you can choose whichever next island you want to, as long as it's within range of like your air cover or your carrier battle groups and your invasion force. And so you can deliberately avoid a enemy strong point and pick a weaker target behind that enemy strong point. And if you can take the weaker target behind the enemy strong point, that enemy strong point is going to have to be abandoned.
Oh, so this is kind of like island leapfrogging.
Exactly. It's leapfrogging.
Okay.
It's leapfrogging. And it becomes a nightmare for the Japanese to try and defend any particular area because once the Americans are strong enough, they can always just go around you and force you back. And so that's what happens. So a place like Rabaul is never attacked directly by the Allies.
Yeah.
It's just surrounded and left to die on the vine, basically.
Oh, I mean, again, it sort of brings up this whole thing of being left to rot on a jungle island.
Right.
Yeah.
And
And
so
this is for the Japanese.
Right.
Then.
Yeah. And there are some Japanese forces which, they become, some of the smaller ones certainly, they become desperate because they're low priority and they don't get resupplied, but they're not evacuated.
Right.
And so in some of these places, these forces are literally just abandoned, and they don't even necessarily get the word when the surrender takes place.
Wow.
And so basically, strategically, the Americans, despite what I just said about island hopping, they have this basically two main thrusts, geographically speaking. One is basically based in Pearl Harbor, led by Chester Nimitz.
Right.
Mainly the work of the United States Navy and Marine Corps.
We're calling it, maybe this is the northern sort of thing,
or maybe
the
the east-west axis, you could
okay,
say.
that's right.
Because they're moving from east to west and island hopping through the island chains in the Central Pacific. And then roughly from south to north or from southeast to northwest is the campaign led by MacArthur, a U.S. and Australian force mainly that fights in New Guinea and basically headed toward the Philippines ultimately.
Okay.
Most military historians and strategists today would say that this is needless duplication, that you don't need both these campaigns. And if you're wondering, okay, why are we doing it? Well, one answer is, because we can. In other words, it's a measure of America's breathtaking production and manpower reserves that we can sustain two major campaigns in two different directions at the same time.
Yeah, in just one of the theaters, not including all the stuff going on in Europe.
Exactly. That just another testimony to our just truly awesome production and economic and military
and again,
capacity.
This is one of the reasons why the Japanese want to win this by late 42, early 43, because now it's too late.
Right, why they had to have a negotiated settlement early on or they're in trouble. The other thing is political, is that MacArthur, for as much as people like FDR and other military leaders in Washington despise him or have contempt for his abilities, he is untouchable politically. He's too well connected to the United States. You have to give him a major role and you have to give him his campaign. He's constantly complaining that he's not getting enough resources, blah, blah. And so, any quote-unquote objective look at this would say, well, MacArthur, you just need to sort of stay in Australia and write your memoirs. You shouldn't be given a major campaign, but they give him one anyway.
Now, does he have a lot of popular support? Is it leaking down to that level?
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely. All right. He is. People are right to fear him because of his support in the public.
Amazing.
He has a masterful public relations shop in his headquarters.
Yeah.
There's talk of him being president
on
more than one occasion.
Yeah.
And so they feel like you can't risk alienating the American people by not giving him a major role. But I would say, like I said, these days, most people would say that pretty much after securing New Guinea, everything else he does is superfluous and a needless waste of lives and resources.
Wow.
And I know that sounds really harsh, but I think it's true.
And you did go into this in more depth in the MacArthur shows that we
right.
did, which again we'll probably offer as encores because this is just bringing up so many issues historically and historiographically, interpretations of history that we need to keep revisiting.
Well, and it's sad, but the only good news here is that the United States can get away with it. Because of
supply.
Right. I mean, I can imagine a nightmare situation where we have to choose, and we choose him because he's politically popular, not because it makes any strategic sense.
Right.
That could have happened, and happily didn't. But Nimitz gets particularly active in 1943 at places like Tarawa, and you start to see these really Guadalcanal was brutal enough, but these are for some even physically smaller places. Some of these tiny atolls, right? These are these ring-shaped islands that are super small. It's essentially the top of a submerged volcano. That's what an atoll is. Where for taking incredibly small bits of real estate, the Americans suffer very, very high casualties. And also inflict very, very high casualties on the Japanese, who once again refuse to surrender.
Yeah, all right, yeah.
And typically the ratio of casualties, Japanese to American, in these fights is essentially 10 to 1.
10 to 1?
10 to 1. So the Americans are suffering, the Japanese are suffering even worse. And so major island chains like the Gilberts and then the Marshalls become the targets of these American island hopping campaigns.
Which of these island hopping campaigns really stand out then?
Yeah, I would say probably the one in the following year, in the summer of 1944.
Okay.
So roughly, just for context, roughly the same time of D-Day in Europe.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you could
Yeah.
argue that because of the vast expanses of territory or of water in the Pacific, that it's taking the Allies, or it's taking them a little longer. They're behind in the timetable compared to Europe, but partly because, like I said, the spaces in Europe are much more compact.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so this is kind of a bigger ask in the Pacific. But in the Marianas, this is an island chain closer to Japan compared to, say, the Gilberts or the Marshalls.
Yeah.
The Marianas is the target of an American offensive in the summer of 1944. A Japanese carrier fleet confronts the U.S. the U.S. invasion force, and this leads to the so-called Battle of the Philippine Sea.
Okay, right. That's what I think most people would have heard of it as.
Right,
Yeah.
Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Americans quickly called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as only Americans would call it.
Yeah.
And here you start to see, here in the most painful way possible, the Americans demonstrate their growing prowess. Not only their strength in numbers, but their growing skill in naval warfare and in naval aviation. Our pilots are better. Our planes are better. We're starting to get a hang of it.
Yeah.
The torpedoes in our submarines work, which they did not early on.
Yeah, that makes a
it's
big
very,
difference.
very sad in the first couple of years of the war where our submariners score hits and the torpedo goes thunk along the hull of the enemy ship.
Remember, of course, Buzzkiller's torpedoes also are supposed to explode when they hit, not just go thunk.
Right, this is not like an arcade.
No, we're bumping the ships.
Yeah. And so in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese lose 500 aircraft to the Americans' 130.
Wow.
Which would...
That's not 10 to 1 like the other.
No,
stat,
but it's
huge.
really lopsided. And the Japanese also lose 3 carriers.
Yeah.
So it's a crippling blow to Japanese naval power. The bloody seizure of the Marianas then proceeds, most famously in Saipan.
Yeah.
Which is a lot bigger than Tarawa and takes a lot of effort. And at the end of this, the Japanese didn't always do this. They did it in the Aleutians when their remaining force is sort of trapped in this one little corner of the island. They basically fix bayonets and charge the Americans.
Oh.
And are slaughtered.
Oh.
In other words, once again, refusing to surrender. And so fighting to the last man in the most aggressive way possible.
Does that mean that they're not, because they're not moving back to other islands, that the island hopping itself is slowing down?
Well, no, you mean the Americans?
Yeah. Because the Japanese aren't retreating to another island.
Oh, well, no. But normally what happens is if you're strong enough to attack an island amphibiously, those Japanese forces cannot retreat.
Okay.
They can't.
Okay, because you're sort of surrounded.
Guadalcanal was different. Guadalcanal, they were able to evacuate some of those soldiers because
right.
the naval waters were still contested. But a place like Saipan, there's no way the Japanese evacuation force could get anywhere close, especially after their navy's just been clobbered in the Philippine Sea. So those Japanese soldiers know that they're not going to be evacuated. And they know they're going to have to fight to the last man, because of their warrior code. And so they, like I said, they fix bayonets.
And then to getting back, is this then, we're still in 44, right? Summer of 44?
Yeah, that's right. 44.
Is this then when MacArthur starts then to really move north?
Yes. Later in 44 is when he starts the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. Before this, he had insisted on taking the island of Peleliu, which is also depicted really, really well in that series, The Pacific.
Yeah, the HBO.
It's based in part on this book by Eugene Sledge, which I highly recommend. It's called, maybe you should put that on the Buzzkill bookshelf.
Absolutely. And by the way, HBO, our email address for sending funds is info@professorbuzzkill.com.
I cannot recommend the book highly enough. It's called With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa by Eugene Sledge. Yeah. It's an amazing book. I actually assigned excerpts from the book for my World War II class. In any case, a lot of his book is about the taking of Peleliu, which is incredibly bloody, and once again, you can argue strategically completely unnecessary. And a prelude to the Philippines campaign, which you can also argue is unnecessary. Sure, on the one hand, you would like to liberate the Filipino people as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
That's certainly true, and that's a legitimate motive. It's very easy to tell people, look, you should just hang on because we don't want any of you killed in an invasion right?
Right.
It's easy to say that. On the other hand, if you look at the physical destruction and the number of Filipinos who die, and that's hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who are going to die,
Yeah.
either as a result of the invasion or a result of Japanese massacres triggered by the invasion. You can really question the necessity of this. In any case, in October 44, you have the Battle of Leyte Gulf,
Yeah.
where the rest of the Japanese fleet is practically destroyed. Leyte, which is a smaller island in the Philippine island chain. Philippines is like 3,000 islands
it's
total.
an
It's a
enormous
huge
number,
number.
yeah.
There are a few main islands. Luzon is the biggest. Leyte is a sort of a mid-sized one. Leyte is invaded and taken. Once again, vicious fighting in horrible conditions. Through the end of the war, MacArthur insists on liberating all the main islands of the Philippines. Once again, I would argue it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
If you really want to get the full Nash takedown of MacArthur, I'd say go dig up those MacArthur episodes.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan, as you might imagine.
Well, and by the way, is there any sense when MacArthur is saying and maybe getting justification back home by saying this is just going to tremendous, popular sport back home, raise morale, so let's do it.
Oh, and I don't think he'd make that argument.
Oh, he would just say...
he would say that this is necessary to defeat Japan. So we have to
all right.
liberate these
Okay,
areas.
well,
And then I'm sure he would have argued that you could use the Philippines as a staging area for invading Japan, but that's also nonsense. Strategically, once the Americans seized Saipan in the summer of 1944, that puts the United States within B-29 bomber range of Japan.
Wow.
You can argue that even further island hopping, but certainly you can argue that taking the Philippines at that point is moot. It is unnecessary. But if you read someone like Max Hastings, who's very good on this, he makes the point that sort of thing, in fairness, is clearer in retrospect
Yes, okay.
than it is
That's
at
right.
the time.
That's right.
At the time, you would have legitimately made a case for full court press. You deploy all the forces you can. You fight the enemy wherever you can. You keep them under constant pressure. And at that level argument, sure, you should invade the Philippines because there are a lot of Japanese forces there, and you can argue you need to just crush the Japanese all over. But if you look at the hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who die, if you look at the 16,000 Americans who give their lives in liberation of the Philippines, this is going to sound harsh, but largely for the sake of MacArthur's ego,
Yeah.
right? He promised he would return, and so now he feels like he has to return.
Yeah.
That, I think he should be have a little greater regard for human life than that, I think.
Right. Okay, well, let's see how well the regard for human life and all those other things continue in the war in the Pacific in the part 3 of this episode, which will be coming to you again later. So once again, thanks, Professor Nash.
My pleasure.
Everyone loves these Nash casts. I get constant emails about when is he coming back? When is he coming back? And he's back, and he's coming back again to do part 3. Talk to you then.